I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania, and I'll be your moderator today. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea and sky. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture and Aboriginal rights. We ask now that you take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. To interact in today's webinar, please use the chat panel on your screen to type and submit questions for today's presenter. Those questions will be answered throughout the webinar today. Only presenter webcams will be used, and there is also 2 handouts in your handouts window, which you now have availability to download. It is now my pleasure to introduce your presenter today from PeopleSense by Altius, Jaydene Tucker. Jaydene is a skilled organisational psychologist focusing on workplace wellbeing, organisational development and diversity and inclusion. Jaydene uses psychological principles to improve mental health, team performance and workplace culture. Known for her excellent training and facilitation skills, Jaydene guides psychosocial risks, psychological safety, diversity, inclusion and leadership. She offers personalised counselling, coaching and team support to drive positive organisational change. And we welcome Jaydene.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that very kind introduction. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's made it a priority to join us here today. I know that we're all leading some very busy, both professional and personal lives. So the fact that you've made today's session a priority is absolutely fabulous. As mentioned, I'm Jaydene and I'm an organisational psychologist here at Altius Group. My specialty is helping organisations to be more proactive as opposed to being reactive when it comes to psychosocial hazards at work. Now, being in the consulting role that I'm in, I get the benefit of seeing organisations of a variety of different sizes, and they work across quite a broad array of industries. And I get to see their different approaches when it comes to managing health and well-being at work. I have had the pleasure of seeing some organizations implement some amazing approaches and obviously reap the benefits of that. But unfortunately, I have also seen some other organizations with some really questionable approaches to this. So today I really hope to share some of the wisdom that I've picked up along the way and to make sure that you've actually got the opportunity to learn from their experiences. Now, something that I really advocate for is please do engage with us as much as you can through today. We've all just put our lives on pause today to actually participate in today's session. So whether it be that you're here live and you're able to interact with us, or if you're someone who's listening to today's recording and able to reflect or maybe have conversations with those around you that are listening, please just make today's session as engaging as possible. Now, before I dive too deeply in today's content, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge Altius Group, which is the organisation that I'm representing here today. For some of you who might not be aware, Altius Group is Australia's leading integrated workplace health and safety organisation. So we do have a team of over 700 people and we work across around 60 locations throughout Australia, which is dedicated to elevating the well-being of Australian people, workplaces and community since 2001. We specialise in evidence-based therapies and we bring the brightest talent and enhanced digital technology to support people and organisations. Now, there are actually many different brands that fall under our Altius Group umbrella, and some of these you might be familiar with. So these specialize in domains like occupational rehab, psychological support, medical examinations, occupational health, employment services, and there's a very long list of many more. Generally, we can break these down into 4 domains. So the first here is our people and employee services, which are really focused on physical and emotional well-being of individuals. We've got our workplace services, and this is the category that I tend to sit under, which is around providing safety and healthy work environments. We've also got our disability services, which is aimed at supporting people with a disability, and also our medical specialists, which are more targeted medical conditions and support mechanisms. All right, so now that you know a bit about me and a bit about where I've come from, I want to talk about you and where you are actually going with us today. So, I've set out today with some pretty ambitious objectives to make sure that you're actually getting some really great value out of our time here together. So, it's my intention that following today's session, you will have firstly, an enhanced understanding of psychosocial hazards and the recent changes in legislation. And I do acknowledge that we've got quite a mixed bag of people with their experience when it comes to psychosocial hazards here today. And I'll do my absolute best to tailor, I guess, to the broad audience that we've got. So, some of you are going to be fellow subject matter experts in the field, and you're going to know a huge amount about psychosocial hazards. Yet, there's also going to be some people here that, are still quite unfamiliar with the concept and still trying to get up to speed. So, I'd also like to look at how we can increase our knowledge of what is considered best practice approaches to psychosocial hazard management. So, what are the things that you should be doing, based on the role that you're actually playing within your organization? I'd like to focus our attention today more so on effective control management. So, we're going to be looking at where are some of the places that organizations go wrong with controls and how can we avoid some of these errors. We'll also be looking at how we can apply the hierarchy of controls for psychosocial hazards. And finally, look at how you can enhance your confidence, when it comes to actually preventing and controlling hazards. And I mean, that's really what we are setting out to achieve here today. So, if there's any of those objectives that I've listed that really stand out to you that you'd like for me to I guess place a bit more of a focus on, please do just note that in the chat, and I'll do my absolute best to make sure that you're getting what you need from that objective here today. All right, now before we dive too deeply, I do just want to take a moment just to get to establish, I guess, what people's confidence levels are when it comes to psychosocial hazards. So, Stephanie is going to kindly load our first poll for today, which asks the question: how confident are you that you understand the recent changes in legislation and how to manage psychosocial hazards? So, our poll options include super confident. Okay. So, you feel like you're on top of it, you know what you're doing, you've got your action plan, and you're implementing it. We've also got some people who are somewhat confident. So they feel like they've got that knowledge base, but they also feel like there's a fair amount that they could learn too. And then finally, we've got our not at all confident. So these are people who are really just racking their brains, trying to make sense of things and trying to get some direction in terms of where they're going. Now, it's always interesting to see with these polls whether they're consistent, with people's ratings or whether they start to chop and change a little bit. From what I could see from when we launched the poll, the somewhat confident appears to be dominating and quite consistently dominating. We've got a few people who are actually feeling very confident, so around 7%. Our somewhat confident is the overall majority, so that's sitting at about 63%. And then we've got about 30% of people who are not at all confident. So I really do hope that we can help to increase everyone's confidence here today. All right. So, look, that gives me a really good gauge as to where people are at for the moment. And as I said, I think that today can be an opportunity for us to try and meet people where they're at. But also, if you've got your own learnings and experience, by undertaking this process yourself, please do feel free to engage, through our chat and interact with us today. All right, so to kick things off, I just want to recap what actually are psychosocial hazards, okay? Now, psychosocial hazards, as defined by SafeWork Australia, are anything that can cause psychological harm. Now, from my experience, we tend to find that employers are quite intimidated by that definition, kind of feeling the weight of this potential pressure to actually manage anything that can cause psychological harm. When we actually walk them through what that definition actually means, it seems to alleviate some of those pressures. But really, these hazards can stem from, firstly, people factors. So, this is more about the social factors at work. So, things like the relationships, the social interactions that we have. For example, are you working in a team where you're isolated from others, or maybe where you're supported by your manager and your team? Okay. So we've then got our job factors. So this is where there's jobs or tasks associated with those jobs where there's actually inherent psychosocial hazards or risks. So, for example, maybe you're working in a role where exposure to trauma is actually quite common and quite regular. We've then got our system factors. So, this is more about the way that tasks or jobs are designed, how they're organized, or how they're managed or supervised. So, maybe there's a million administrative hoops that you need to get through in order to get something done. Okay. And then finally, we've got our environmental factors. So, this is more about the equipment, the working environment, or maybe the requirement to undertake duties in a hazardous environment. Okay. So that gives us a bit of a base to work off today in terms of what psychosocial hazards actually are and what they're talking about. Now, WorkSafe have identified 14 psychosocial hazard categories, and this actually really helps us in terms of being more specific and more concrete about what these hazards are that people could be potentially exposed to. Now, I personally find it helpful to categorize these in terms of our people, our job, and our systems factors, as it helps us to see if maybe there's some common themes or common trends that are actually emerging. When I run training sessions, I often talk about this concept of like the spider web, that sometimes you can find that there's actually links between psychosocial hazards, where maybe you've got one, but because of the nature of that hazard, it actually leads to another and maybe another. So sometimes when you put in place a control, it can actually do a great job at addressing several psychosocial hazards all at once. Okay, now what does our legislation actually say our requirements are when it comes to addressing these hazards? So let's first consider, well, what actually is the objective of the Work Health and Safety Act? So, the Act's role is to ensure the health and safety of workers by protecting people against harm to their health, safety, and welfare. And I think that throughout today, it's really important that we keep coming back to that as the key objective of this shift in legislation and this focus on psychosocial hazards. So, we need to do this through the elimination or the minimization of risks that arise from work. And it's important to note that the Act has always actually featured psychological health. However, the amendments have now included this reference to psychosocial risk. Okay. So, in terms of the importance of this, we know that there's many reasons beyond just legislative compliance as to why someone should be managing psychosocial hazards within their organization. So, firstly, and for many organizations, importantly, there's great financial benefits. So, we know that early intervention to mental health challenges can reduce costs associated with absenteeism due to mental health. And we know that this costs the Australian economy around 13 to $17 billion each year. Now, in addition to this, we know that it can also reduce the cost of workers' compensation claims. And we know that the median compensation claim for mental health is actually 4 times that of physical injuries. All right. So the focus on, psychosocial hazard management should be of just as much importance as actually, managing physical hazards. We know that Australian organisations can also expect a return on investment of around 2.3 when they're creating mentally healthy workplaces. So that means that for every dollar spent on successfully implementing an action that creates a mental health initiative, the organisation is going to receive approximately $2.30 back on average. And then looking beyond finances, we actually know that when organizations prioritize and actively promote well-being, we know that employees are actually 2.5 times more likely to view their organization as the best performer. Okay, so we can see here how this can actually have a domino effect when it comes to the retention of staff, the performance of staff, etc. So, I mean, I tend to adapt my approach when I'm talking about the benefits, of addressing psychosocial hazards with organizations based on what's most important to them. So sometimes we'll have very values and morals based organizations that really just want to do the best for their people. But sometimes there will be organizations that are really, driven by the financial benefits, the enhanced reputation, improved engagement. And sometimes we can find that people on the ground are really committed and really passionate towards these things, but maybe at more of a senior management level, maybe there's not that buy in, that investment in this. So I think that sometimes having these statistics to reference and really just trying to look at the figures and, in black and white, the potential benefits of an organization can actually go a really long way. Okay, so it's important to understand how due diligence actually applies to psychosocial risk. So, for those of you who aren't actually familiar with this technology, due diligence is describing the reasonable steps an employer, a business, or anyone who falls under the definition of a PCBU must undertake to ensure compliance. Now, the key factors organizations at large need to think about when it comes to meeting due diligence are actually displayed by the figure that I've got here. So, firstly, we've got our knowledge acquisition. So, it's really about doing what you're doing today and actually understanding your legal obligations, obtaining support from a specialist where if maybe you don't have that internal resourcing to really understand what's taking place, or maybe work health and safety isn't a primary component of your role, then you might engage an expert. It's also about the provision of resources. So it's about having, a work health and safety management system. So, I mean, when we talk in a few slides about the four-step process of actually preventing and managing risk, it's about making sure that your systems actually enable that. It's also about ensuring that your staff, your people leaders, etc., are actually trained and competent when it comes to understanding their responsibilities when it comes to psychosocial hazard management, reporting, addressing hazards if they are reported, etc., and also maintaining these systems and processes and making sure that they're actually being done effectively. It's then about understanding hazards and risks. So, this is really about conducting your risk assessments and making sure that information is ready, available, if there are operations that need to be implemented and whatnot. So, it's about actually undertaking that process. And then it's about actually implementing processes. So, making sure that you're doing that consultation with your workers, implementing a risk management process, stopping any unsafe work practices, and actually putting in place your controls, which we'll get into in a lot more detail as we go through today. Now, I understand, I guess, some of what I've mentioned there can seem quite intimidating, but I think it's about reminding yourself that this is something that it really is an ongoing cycle. So I guess zoning in on the understanding hazards and risks, and that is where I'll be focusing our attention here today, actually brings me to our risk management framework. So the legislation gives very specific reference to the duty of PCBUs to identify and manage risk. Now, psychosocial risk management doesn't need to be complicated. And in fact, we're using the same frameworks that we would use when it comes to managing risk more broadly. So, we're actually using the same four-step management process that's used to manage physical hazards or hazards more generally. So the process requires a workplace to be able to identify the hazards that could give rise to risks to health and safety, and to try and eliminate these as far as reasonably practical. And I'll chat about that term a little bit as we go through today. So it's really about identifying any potential psychosocial hazards, assessing the impact of them and the level of risk associated with them, It's then about implementing controls, okay? So either trying to eliminate or minimize them as much as possible, and then undertaking a review of any control measures implemented to make sure that they're actually being effected. Um, Now, I just want to pause for a moment, and if people through the chat could just share which of these steps have you actually undertaken already, if at all. Um, so, I mean, maybe you're at the process of maybe doing a psychosocial risk assessment at the moment, which would be more so, the identification and the assessment. Maybe you're looking more at the controls. So you've actually got, your risk assessment outcomes. You've conducted consultation with workers, and now I guess you're undertaking this consultation with them about what controls you'd actually be implementing. Or maybe you've already undertaken those first three processes and now you're looking at actually reviewing and maintaining. Okay. Now, something really critical here is that you'll actually see that consultation's a critical component in all of those phases. So we regularly need to be consulting our workers. Now, I'm just monitoring the chats here to see what's coming through.
So
Steph, are
some,
there any?
yes,
Yeah, jump in,
yeah. So
Steph.
some, yeah, some comments are coming through. Identified. Hold on, got moved to stop. All well-established practices, looking at controls, identified and assessed risks. Some are controlled, others are yet to be. We're looking through 1 to 3 as an ongoing process, which we're trying to get better at. Identified and assessed. Steps 1, 2, 3 completed. Assessing risks, assess risks, determine best controls. In the first process stage still, as a staff member, I have identified the risks, but it is tricky to then escalate that discussion to management as a problem to solve. So consultation occurs. No risk assessment has been completed, all of them, but some are piecemeal as to what they address. There are complications in that only part of our policies are run in-house. We completed an internal survey using the People at Work survey, which was fantastic, currently at the control stage. Have done all compliance, offer in construction, looking to have FSC compliance for affordable housing. Another one as well, we have completed the People at Work survey, assessed risks and identified some hazards. We are at the stage of implementing action plans to mitigate risks. And there was also a question, a couple of questions that came through, Jaydene, if you wanted to answer them now. So the first one, how responsible is the employer regarding an employee with external psychosocial issues, for example, managing effects from a previous employer bullying?
Okay. Sorry, Steph. I feel overwhelmed at the amount of engagement right now. It's really, I think, sorry, just to go back for a sec, I think anyone who's already taken action, with undertaking these steps, I just want to give you all a pat on the back for getting to the point that you're actually at already. I think it's really great to hear that the majority of respondents, are already at that kind of phase 3. So that's really brilliant. I think just coming back to that question around how responsible is an employer regarding an employee with external psychosocial issues. So, firstly, I just want to clarify that employers are responsible for managing psychosocial hazards experienced by employees, contractors, and volunteers. So that's something that sometimes people can, be a bit curious about their responsibilities in that domain. Um, I'm not sure so much about if it comes to, I guess, previous employers, because technically that's not really something that's taking place under your organization. And this is where I guess individual mental health and, we can have individuals within our teams and within our organizations who are experiencing mental health challenges, whether it be from previous employers or just, within isolation. Um, So I'm not really sure if that's a psychosocial hazard per se, just because it hasn't taken place in your organization. But as you can see from some of the previous content that we've discussed, it's within an employer's best interest to be supporting the mental health and the physical health of their employees. So if that's something that you notice within an employee that they're struggling with, I'd be encouraging for someone that that person's comfortable with, ideally maybe a supervisor or a manager, to be having some one-on-one discussions with that person just to unpack what could be implemented to support that person in the workplace. So, for example, if they've experienced bullying, well, then maybe they're quite sensitive to feedback or maybe a bit distrustful when it comes to interacting with individuals. So, I think that needs to be managed more at an individual level of, well, what can we do to support you, given those experiences. But I don't think it's for the organization to be trying to address what's happened at a previous organization, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question, Steph?
I think so. And there was just one other question that came through, Jaydene. Is risk assessment, sorry, just bring it back up. Is risk assessment required by the legislation?
Yes, it is. So yeah, so I really encourage if anyone is curious to go and read the codes of practice, which is very specific about what an employer's obligation is. So I know that that can be found on the WorkSafe Tasmania website, or at least a link to it. So I really do encourage going and having a read at that, which goes in a lot more specific detail about what your obligations are. I know there's another interesting question here, Steph, which is how to gain buy in to implement controls in a sector where exposure to psychosocial risk is seen as a part of the expectations or culture. So, for example, in frontline healthcare, I think that that's going to be a really good one that I might reference as we go through and chat about some of the controls. So, thanks for that one.
Uh,
Um, okay, so to keep moving on when it comes to assessing risk, um, people are likely going to be familiar with the risk matrix here or some variation of the same. Um, so, this is something that actually enables organizations to consider the risk, and this will then help inform what is considered reasonably practical when implementing controls. So, going back to that question before about how to actually gain buy in, using a risk assessment tool such as this can really help to justify just why it is so important to be implementing controls. So, as you can see here, we're actually classifying the risk based on, well, what is the likelihood that the risk could occur, whether that be very likely, likely, unlikely, or very unlikely. And then it's also about actually looking at the consequences. So, what are the potential consequences of that? I have seen some variations of this tool to try and better adapt it to psychosocial risk, which also includes the frequency. So, how frequently is someone also being exposed to psychosocial hazards as well? So, there's different variations of this which is floating around. And obviously, it's for you to decide what's going to help best inform your assessment of risk. Now, throughout today's session, I do really want to focus our attention on identifying and implementing control measures. So, as such, we won't be going through the other steps in too much detail. And I really want to focus our attention today at looking at how we can best control risks. So, once you know which psychosocial hazards are present and you have the assessed risks that they create, you're in a better position to actually control them. So you must eliminate risk to health and safety as far as reasonably practical to do so. And if it's not reasonably practical to try and eliminate the risks, well, then you must try and minimize them as much as possible. Now, every workplace is different, and the best combination of control measures is going to be tailored to your organization's size, type, work activities, and to try and manage the risks, both in everyday operations but also in emergencies. Now, I'll be chatting about, I guess, what this term reasonably practical looks like in a second. But before I do, I mean, ideally, what we need to do is try and identify as many possible control measures as you can. So sometimes we jump too quickly into judging control measures before we actually consider, well, what possible courses of action, do we actually have? It's then about considering, well, which of these control measures are most effective, and then also looking at, well, which control measures are actually going to be reasonably practical given the circumstances. Okay, so let's chat about this term reasonably practical. So often when we're working with employers, they're very intimidated by this term, or they tend to use other organizations as a bit of a benchmark rather than what the regulators are actually saying. So I like to think about reasonably practical as almost being this spectrum of potential courses of action. So on one end, you've got take absolutely no action. So almost like the least uh, proactive course of action possible, which is virtually do nothing. And then on the other extreme, you've actually got take the most extreme action to eliminate or control the hazard as much as you possibly can. So, this term reasonably practical is really about looking at, well, where on this spectrum is actually reasonable and practical for us as an organization, what controls to implement in order to address, these risks that are occurring. So there's certain factors that we need to take into account, which will help you work out where on that spectrum you actually land. So these are things like actually thinking about the likelihood of the hazard or the risk occurring, which if you've done your risk assessment based on that matrix that I showed you before, that will help to inform that. It's also about looking at the degree of harm from the hazard or the risk, which that matrix will help with. It's also about looking at knowledge about ways of actually eliminating or minimizing the risk. So, what is your knowledge of what is actually likely to work? It's about looking at the availability and suitability of ways to eliminate and minimize the risk. And then it's also about looking at cost. Okay. So we know that reasonably practical is a legal requirement, and it's about doing what you are reasonably able to do to ensure the health and safety of your workers. Okay, so let's have a look at a bit of a case study of a manager who's actually had to decide, well, what is reasonably practical? Okay, so here we've got Quinn. Um, so Quinn is the manager of a team of customer service representatives that work face to face with members of the public. Quinn's received occasional reports from members of their team about customers displaying aggressive and verbally abusive behavior towards members of their team. So, just jumping into the chat, what do you think would be reasonably practical for Quinn to implement to support their team for these instances of aggression or verbal abuse? So, what do you think would be reasonable? Okay, so chances are some of you are feeling a bit stuck, and maybe you're feeling like there's not enough information there. Maybe you're just using your own experience and judgment of what's worked, what might not work. I can see there's a few considerations, I guess,
There's a
for
few
other
things coming
factors.
in, so including further training, physical controls and signage, as well as training. There's some clear guidelines on what their response can be, right to disconnect, signage about will not tolerate poor behaviours, providing debriefing, procedures to deal with these types of cases, sharing an expectation of a code of conduct with customers, training and de-escalation, offer EAP, place some signage up saying that, staff training on how to manage these behaviours, two-person shift put in a screen, um, it to be tolerated and monitor, training in de-escalation, some training in dealing with client aggression, counter protection such as glass dividers, response strategy and cooling down mechanism for team members. Customers advise they will be able to leave if they do not behave appropriately. Monitor training again on how to deal with difficult customers, EAP, educate customers and display behaviour policies for all, briefing, regular supervision and debrief opportunities, place again signs up around zero tolerance, informal talk, training on respectful behaviour, science discussions in team meetings, management support, security, policy around terminating calls, policy around when ceasing, talking to clients, availability of support afterwards, training regarding de-escalation, supervisor present at the time or immediately after,
Great.
empower the yeah, there's quite a few comments around training and signage. So yeah, some yeah, very good interaction there.
Thanks, Stephanie. And I can see we've got many psychosocial hazard management experts here in the chat today. Um, so, look, let's have a look at what Quinn actually did. So, firstly, Quinn looked at what control measures were already in place. And it's interesting because sometimes we can see organizations wanting to turn to like the new shiny thing when sometimes all they need is a better promotion or a re-promotion of existing controls that are actually in place, or looking at maybe they've been established, but maybe they haven't been implemented properly. So Quinn first looked at what control measures are in place, and Quinn also held discussions with staff to better understand the risk and how well these controls were working. So you can see here that consultation process is actually really critical because Quinn might not be the person who's actually experiencing some of this abuse. So it would be difficult for Quinn to make a decision and a judgment call of what would be appropriate given that they're actually not on the ground, understanding what some of the potential contributing factors are. Now, Quinn, following that consultation, decided it was not reasonably practical to significantly increase security measures such as hiring security personnel, and that was due to the low occurrence of the risk. So what Quinn did do was similar to many of the suggestions that we had, is implementing more cost-effective controls. So looking at screens at counters, workers working in pairs, signage on customer behavior, and also providing staff training on dealing with aggressive behavior. Okay. So this just shows that process that as a people leader or as someone leading psychosocial risk management within your organization, that process of identifying what the hazard and the risk is, consulting with your staff, obviously through both the identification and the assessment, but then also consulting around potential control measures, and then that implementation and review process. Okay, so I want to talk now about our hierarchy of controls, and what you're looking at here might look a little bit different to the typical hierarchy of controls that you're used to. Now, if Quinn was smart, she'll consider the hierarchy of controls when identifying potential controls. So many of you will be familiar with the hierarchy of controls for hazard management. Now, sometimes this model doesn't easily translate to psychosocial hazards. So over here, you'll see a bit of a revised version of this hierarchy, which outlines what it could look like for psychosocial hazards. So, very similar to our traditional model, hazard elimination is a golden standard. So, this involves the complete removal of the hazard. Now, the top three interventions place more emphasis on changing the work. So, this is the preferred method as it offers greater breadth and reliability of protection. Now, the bottom two interventions actually more of a focus on the worker themselves. So this is the less preferred option due to the lower level of reliability and of protection. Okay. That being said, a mixture of all methods can and should be used to address psychosocial risks when these arise. And we know that every workplace is different. So the best combination of control measures will really be tailored to your organization's size, the type, the work activities that you're engaged in. And this should be applied both in everyday operations, but also emergencies. Now, I just want to take a moment to load our next poll, Steph, if that's okay. And our poll question is around which level of the hierarchy of controls do you feel like organizations actually focus more of their attention on? So, do you feel like organizations are focused on hazard elimination, redesigning work, adjusting work, educating, or maybe putting in place those administrative controls, or encouraging and promoting workers to access some of those wellbeing and mental health supports? All right. I haven't seen one elimination yet, which is a little bit concerning. Oh, there we go. We got one, which is good to see. I can definitely see a lot of focus on education and administration, which in my line of work, it's absolutely a big trend that we tend to see. And I mean, I don't want to be hard on employers because sometimes it's a case of you don't know what you don't know. And if employers aren't educated in what other interventions could be implemented for elimination, for redesign, for adjustment, etc., well, then sometimes we can just turn to some of the things that we know, which is often training or maybe implementing policies or EAP and things like that. And I'm not here today to say that those things are a negative thing to be implemented. I mean, I'm one of our top facilitators, if that makes sense. So I think the education piece, the policy piece, EAP programs absolutely have their place. But I think a lot of our work now in our organizational services team is providing that education to employers that, if possible, it would be great if we could eliminate these hazards at the core so that employees don't have that dependency on things like resilience training or accessing the EAP and whatnot. So it's more about having that balance in addressing the psychosocial hazards on all levels. All right. Now, I do just have one of my favorite memes here, which really does shed light on, I guess, sometimes one of the ways that we can see organizations go wrong in this domain. And I will be shedding light on this a little bit later. So, before we delve into actions for prevention and solutions, I do just want to acknowledge that I mean, we do have people here today that might be, feeling the frustrations of maybe enjoy the resilience training in the fruit bowl, when they're just drowning in an environment of psychosocial hazards. But that being said, I know that there are some extremely well intentioned people leaders, organizations that are doing their absolute best to try and address these psychosocial hazards, but facing their own limitations in these domains as well. Okay. Um, so let's actually look at what these different tiers encompass, when it comes to our hierarchy of controls. And a lot of today, I want to be providing you education on what these different levels look like if you are trying to implement controls for psychosocial hazards. So let's start off with elimination and what this could actually look like. So, elimination is really about removing the psychosocial hazards and trying to eliminate the risk from harm, in someone's aspect of work. So many of you will be familiar with the job demands and job resources theory. So this is about acknowledging that sometimes things like stress and burnout can actually result from an imbalance between the demands being placed on an individual and the resources that they've got to meet those demands. So this rebalancing could look like maybe setting more achievable workloads, setting more achievable performance targets, and trying to reflect, that there are sufficient resources available. For some organizations, we're looking at a great uptake of technology. So, actually using tools and software that tries to automate repetitive tasks. So, this removes some of that monotony that people might experience at work, but it helps to streamline things so that people can focus their time and their attention elsewhere. Sometimes it can be about the occupational environment. So, if there's more of these physical hazards and risks that are emerging, maybe it's about removing exposure to noisy equipment. So, something that we're encouraging employees to do is sometimes the overstimulation in a work environment where I guess our shift to working remotely and working online has meant that our office design isn't really designed in a way that enables for me to be sitting here at my meeting, someone sitting to my right in their meeting, someone to the left in their meeting. So it's really about looking at the work environment and how that tries to reduce some of those risks and those hazards. Sometimes it might be about customer management too. So things like maybe having an effective zero tolerance policy for aggressive behavior or using technology to actually completely remove the requirement to interact with customers in the first place. So going back to Quinn's scenario, this might actually be something that they could have explored for some of the customer aggression that they were facing. And we've also got our behavioral action too. So this is more about taking necessary action to manage problematic employees or leaders. And this one's more about talking about things like bullying, harassment, racism, etc. That's actually experienced within the workplace. Okay, so moving on to our redesign. So we're taking it a notch down in terms of that hierarchy of controls. So this is more about fundamentally redesigning how work is done, including roles, responsibilities, in the work environment. So sometimes it's about injecting task variety, so actually redesigning jobs in a way that provides a bit more variety to keep people engaged, in their work and actually help them support their professional development. Some of you might have heard about this concept of job crafting, which is about empowering employees to modify their tasks and responsibilities to align with their strengths and interests. And I want to be first to call out Altius Group and actually saying that they welcomed my approach to crafting my own role within the organization. So it's very much something that we've welcomed from our employees. We've also got skill enhancement. So it's actually about redesigning learning and development programs and opportunities so that employees can learn new skills. And this means that they can have more variety in the tasks that they're actually doing. So, for example, let's say you've got someone who's the only person that can do a certain task within their organization and they need a day of maybe personal leave or sick leave, or maybe you'd like for them to just take some annual leave or some time off. Having that skill enhancement of other employees actually enables for that individual to not have such dependency on them to be doing it all themselves. We've also got job enrichment. So, this is more about redesigning jobs to include more challenging and more meaningful tasks. And this will give people a real sense of accomplishment and growth. So, this can be particularly important for people who are working in roles where maybe their work is a bit more mundane or repetitive in nature. So, making sure that they've actually got that enrichment as well. And we've also got job rotation or resourcing. So this is about enabling employees to actually rotate between different roles or departments, and that can actually be something that's tapped in really nicely to that skill enhancement and the job enrichment as well. Okay, so as we move down our hierarchy of controls, you're going to be starting to get a lot more familiar with some of the things that we're talking about. So now we're moving on to our adjustment. So this is more about making adjustments to existing practices. Okay, so maybe you'll substitute tasks with more safer alternatives, or maybe you'll look at increasing resources to actually meet demands. So this is things like maybe giving employees more autonomy or control over their work or their processes through decision making. So trying to reduce that micromanagement. It's also about looking at flexible work arrangements. And I know that there's plenty of employees out there that have really tried to optimize this and have really been able to reap the benefits, of that increased flexibility for their people. Collaborative work environments are actually creating spaces and opportunities for that open collaboration, that social interaction and support for team members. And this is one that's particularly important for, if you are implementing those flexible work arrangements, maybe people are able to work remotely or working from home. It's about making sure that you're not losing that collaboration, as we know it's something that really helps to enhance engagement with a team and an organization and someone's work, and also enhance that job satisfaction there too. It's also about looking at the physical workplace. So, looking at things like natural light, comfort, ergonomic equipment. I know that through the pandemic, that was a focus, but it's about making sure that it's that continuity of making sure that people are physically set up to do their work as well. Also having these feedback mechanisms, so not just waiting until you're doing your quarterly reviews or year reviews, or however often they're taking place, but making sure that there's those feedback loops, for concerns to be raised on a regular basis and for them to be addressed in a really timely manner. And to also have those reporting mechanisms, so some really clear processes to report psychosocial hazards, and even considering a whistleblower policy to protect people who might be reporting hazards as well. So, a lot of organizations have done this really well from a physical hazard reporting mechanism, but now it's about going back and making sure that that's actually available for psychosocial hazard reporting mechanisms as well. We've then got our education and our administration, and I tend to find this is where employees are really familiar, as we saw through our poll. So this is about training workers to understand their work policies, their procedures, their expectations, such as implementing policies and procedures. So I'd be curious how many people we've got on the line here that have actually implemented a psychosocial hazard prevention policy. If you do have one of those, please do share so in the chat. I'd just be curious for myself. Also looking at onboarding. So what kind of formal processes do you actually have for staff in introducing new staff members and making sure that they've got that sufficient training information and resources to perform their roles? So embedding it, within a part of your onboarding process. Also looking at manager and leadership development programs. So making sure that your people leaders have enhanced knowledge, skills, and attributes, when it comes to working those supervisory roles. Also having your employee training. So making sure that your employees are trained on psychosocial hazards, but also at an individual level, what different things that they could be putting in place to support themselves. And also other information and resources. So things like implementing maybe a personal wellbeing plan. So that's more about at an individual level, what someone could actually do. I might just pause for a moment because there's some very relevant and interesting questions coming through the chat. So, what would a whistleblower policy look like? So, that might be a policy that outlines that if you are an employee who reports a psychosocial hazard, what protections would be put in place for that employee to make sure that they're not being persecuted for flagging a psychosocial hazard? So it would be about outlining what the organization's commitment is for whistleblowers and what the organization's process is for that. If that is something that's of interest to you, please feel free to connect us at Altius Group. We are able to put together different policies for psychosocial hazards. I'm not sure whether WorkSafe Tasmania also has some information and resources on that, so it might be about having a look at their website as well. Steph, did you want to jump in?
Uh, yes, so please head to the worksafe.tas.gov.au website for further information in that space.
Fabulous, thank you. So look, the final tier of our hierarchy of controls is actually that encourage and promotion. Now, this is something we tend to see organizations do quite heavily. So things like reporting, so actively reporting or encouraging reporting of psychosocial hazards. Also, psychological safety and inclusive culture. So we know that there's a direct link between there being a culture of inclusion and psychological safety and people's likeliness to actually be whistleblowers and to call out psychosocial hazards if they're there. It's also about the general promotion of wellbeing, such as through employee assistance programs, manager assistance programs, and other initiatives and interventions. You might put in place a peer support program. And I think that earlier I spotted a question about whether peer support programs were something good to look at. Look, there's conflicting evidence around peer support programs, and the conflict is there because it depends on how the program is implemented. So I'm not going to black and white call out a statement of whether they're good or bad. It really depends on how an organization actually trains their peer supporters, how people are engaged in that peer support, and how people are linked to additional supports following that peer support as well. I've definitely seen some organizations that it's worked really well at though. So it could be something to be explored depending on how it's actually implemented. Also looking at leadership role models, and there's a huge amount of research of the role of leaders in setting a precedent for organizational attitudes towards things such as psychosocial risks. So I think it does need to start, from the top down, where leaders need to be making psychosocial hazard management a priority and really encouraging for workers to be uptaking controls that are put in place. And finally, things like recognition, rewards, and different celebrations. Okay. So hopefully you're feeling really equipped with some places or some, domains to go when it comes to psychosocial hazard management and what potential controls you could be exploring. Obviously, there's not a one size fits all, and it's really for you to consult with your workers and work out what what could potentially help address the psychosocial hazards or risks that you're looking at. Now, I do just want to take a moment to share with you from my experience where we tend to see organizations going wrong. So, firstly, abandoning controls due to costs. So, something that organizations don't seem to realize is that it's going to be more costly if these hazards and risks continue to exist within your organization. So, I don't think that cost is a sufficient excuse. And from what we're seeing from our regulators, it's not a sufficient excuse to them as well. So, it's not something that we should be overlooking just due to cost. There's so many amazing pieces of information and resources and cost effective mechanisms out there now for organizations to consider. Sometimes we also see overlooking significant psychosocial hazards. So, just the complete dismissal of things that are actually really severe in nature. So, it's something that needs to be taken extremely seriously and something that organizations need to make a top priority. Something else we tend to see is not consulting with workers. So, people leaders or organizations or HR or people in culture, etc., just being quite dogmatic in them deciding what they think is the best thing for workers and not engaging workers through that process of consultation. Sometimes we see these band aid solutions, so just kind of doing something quite quickly and quite thoughtlessly rather than thinking, about those higher levels of controls. So I really do challenge you to actually think, okay, well, what could we do to completely eliminate this hazard and otherwise working from the top down in terms of minimization? Sometimes using a one size fits all solution. So, assuming that something that works for one area of the business is going to work for all areas of the business when that really isn't the case. Sometimes failing to support implementation. So, just assuming that a people leader is capable of implementing something just because you've linked them in or told them what to do, as opposed to really helping them to implement it. Um, and possibly the most important one is actually not reviewing control measures. So I think it's brilliant for organizations to take the time and money, to invest in these control measures, but it's really critical that you actually take the time to make sure that they're actually working. Okay. So I want to leave you here with a really critical call to action. I know that it's brilliant to join these sessions and to be thinking about it in the moment about all these amazing things that you can be doing. But I'd like for you in the chat today to just share what is one thing that you'd like to do differently for today's session. So you're not alone in this space. And I hope that just through the engagement here today, you've seen that there's many people from many different organizations, big, medium, and small, a variety of different industries that are trying to navigate this space. But what is your call to action? What is something that you today would like to dedicate to doing differently? So, I would just like to revisit, I guess, what we set out to achieve here today. So, hopefully, you have an enhanced understanding of psychosocial hazards and those changes in legislation. You've got an increased knowledge of best practice approaches to psychosocial hazard management, and you've got some insight on where organizations tend to go wrong. Hopefully, you've got a bit more understanding of those hierarchy of controls and also some greater confidence and a better ability to actually prevent and control those psychosocial hazards. Um, if you would like to get in touch with us, we've got a whole team that's dedicated to working with organizations when it comes to psychosocial hazard management. So, irrespective of where you're at, within that 4-stage process, please do scan the QR code. You can reach out to us at Altius Group through our Altius Group website as well. Drop us a line and let us know what you need help with. And I'm more than happy to take the time to chat with you and just find out where you're at and what you might need assistance with. Um, so otherwise, I might hand it back to you, Stephanie.
No, thank you, Jaydene, for your webinar today, run as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month. We are coming up to the end of the scheduled time for the webinar, but if you're happy to answer a couple of questions that that came through, Jaydene, and anyone else who would like to stay on line to hear those responses. If you are unable to stay with us, today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on WorkSafe Tasmania's YouTube page.
Fabulous. I'm
Uh,
happy to stay on the line, Steph.
so firstly, how can staff support managers if the managers are let down by their employer?
Trying to understand the dynamics of that. So, staff supporting managers, if managers have tried to escalate things up and maybe been knocked back, I think it's about having open conversations. I mean, I especially feel for managers and especially middle managers. I think that sometimes they can be in a really difficult position. So I think it's about firstly acknowledging that your people leaders are human and that they've got their own needs for well-being and work-life balance and the ability to go to work and actually feel safe at work. So I think it's about having conversations with them and maybe asking them, what can I do to better support you given the challenges that you're navigating as well? Great question.
Thanks. Are mental first aid officers a handy tool for the workplace?
So this is one of the ones where there has been some conflicting evidence here as well. So I mean, I'm a huge advocate for people to have mental health literacy and to be aware of the way that different ways that mental health can present in the workplace. I think that if an organization had a pool of money that they were looking to invest, I'd encourage looking more so at psychosocial hazards that they're experiencing and conducting that consultation with workers to look at what controls would be the most effective for them. Sometimes we can find that mental health first aiders are more so responsive to staff who are already experiencing distress as opposed to trying to prevent the distress from occurring in the first place. So I think that mental health first aiders might be looking a little bit further down, I guess, that hierarchy of controls. And I'm not saying that they're a horrible thing to have. I think that, mental health first aid education is brilliant to have. But if an organization was looking at choosing, I'd be looking at hazard elimination or the kind of that high level of minimization as a first control.
No, thank you, Jaydene. What do you suggest where systems are in place but people do not feel safe to use them?
I think that's a really difficult situation. And sometimes it's encouraging employees to think about you might not be comfortable with the system, but can you identify just one person in the organization who you do feel safe going to? And maybe using them as a trusted person to have that discussion with and maybe say, I don't know what to do. I'm not comfortable with the system. And even just having an ally to help to navigate that system if you're not comfortable with it, at least you're not feeling alone in having to navigate that. I also think sometimes engaging external mechanisms such as the EAP or the Manager Assist program could also be another mechanism to get that external support.
All right, no, thank you, Jaydene. And just to wrap up, a number of comments have come through in respect to the presentation, how informative and valuable it has been. So we thank our presenter today, Jaydene Tucker from PeopleSense by Altius Group for her webinar, Implementing Effective Controls for Psychosocial Hazards in the Workplace. And today's webinar has been run as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month. WorkSafe Tasmania Month runs throughout the month of October. Please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to see what other webinars and in-person events we have running throughout this month. Thank you again to our presenter, Jaydene Tucker, and thank you to everyone for attending. Please have a safe and healthy rest of the day. Thank you.